Welcome to NIDCD SBIR STTR application workshop. So I'm Dr. Shiguang, a scientific review officer from NIDCD review branch, here to address the review-related questions. My goal for this session is that you will gain some important insight about the peer review process of SBIR STTR applications, which in turn will help with preparation of your application. So in this session, we will cover where is SBIR STTR application are reviewed, who review them, how applications are reviewed, and other important components of the process. Review of SBIR STTR applications primarily occurs in the Center of Scientific Review, CSR, but some application may be reviewed by review branch in a specific institute or center. Where your application will be reviewed is specified in the funding opportunity announcement, FOA. There are two types of announcements, omnibus and targeted FOAs. These slides contrast their differences in terms of due dates, review, and application instructions. Generally, applications responding to FOA that will be reviewed in CSR, and application responding to a targeted FOA may be reviewed by a specific institute or center review branch. Please read the FOA carefully, particularly the targeted FOA, which may contain additional instructions regarding the application preparation. Another piece of advice is to contact your program officer, Dr. Roger Miller, before starting your application process. He will provide valuable guidance specific to your SBIR STTR applications. After submitting your application through grants.gov to NIH, the Division for Receipt and Referral will assign your application based on the mission area relevance to an institute. Your application will also be assigned to an initial review group. In CSR, there are more than 30 SBIR STTR review panels. Applications assigned to NIDCD are typically assigned to initial review group named Small Business, Aging, Auditory, Vision, and No Vision Technology, ETTN 12. Here is the slide URL for the ETTN 12 if you are interested in getting more information about this panel. If you respond to a NIDCD specific FOA, it may be reviewed at NIDCD review branch. The URL is also provided for further information. This branch is led by Dr. Melissa Stick. A specific emphasis panel will be convened to review these SBIR STTR applications. Now you may wonder who these reviews are. Well, SBIR STTR panels are made up of a mix of experts from academics and industries. They are productive and well-funded scientists, have expertise and familiarity with the funding mechanisms, and are willing to serve the community. Each application is assigned a minimum of 3 reviews, and each review typically reviews multiple applications with different topics and types, such as phase 1, phase 2, or STTR. Each assigned review provides a preliminary impact score and written critiques from their perspective. I would like to emphasize this. This is a group panel review. The review will list their strengths and weakness they have identified during the evaluation of the application, and then there is a discussion among all panel members regarding the noted strengths and weaknesses. After the discussion, each reviewer who is not in conflict with the application will provide a final score for the application. Now, the question is, how do they evaluate my application? What criteria do they use? The evaluation are divided into two parts. First, 5 scored review criteria. These are significance, investigators, innovation, approach, and environment. Reviews lists strengths and weaknesses for each criteria and give a criterion score between 1 and 9. The second part includes additional review criteria which are not individually scored, such as protection of human subjects, inclusion of women, minorities, and across lifespan, vertebrates, animals, and biohazards. After commenting on these additional criteria, reviewers will combine these two parts and provide an overall impact score between 1 and 9. The score you receive is the average score of the panel times 10, so it is between 10 and 90. A question we often get is what makes an application good? This slide lists the common components of successful applications. These points are self-explanatory. On the other hand, the criticism we often hear are also the points you should try to avoid. These include low commercial potential, no innovation or low level of innovation, lack of objectively measurable feasibility statement or measure of success for the phase 1 work plan, and the PI has little or no experience in the area. This also teaches us to think from review perspective when we put our application together. Since the review panel consists of experts from different areas, and some may not be exactly in your field, you need to demonstrate your understanding of the field, the appropriateness of your scientific plan, and your team's competence to carry out the plan. Also, you need to demonstrate why the topic is important and your approach is valid and feasible. The overall goal is to create a clear and compelling presentation to the review panel. What other things are important in the review process? Please make sure you are accessing current information on NIH policies and FOAs. Here are 2 policies that are critical for both application preparation and review. Policy on the rigor and transparency, and policy on clinical trials. Effective January 2016, NIH introduced the rigor and transparency policy to enhance the reproducibility of research findings. This policy has been evolving since the introduction. The 4 key elements are listed in these slides: the rigor of prior research, rigorous experimental design for robust and biased results, consideration of relevant biological variables, and authentication of key biological and chemical resources. How does this policy affect grants preparation and application review can be found in the URL in the slide. Another important policy relates to the expanding of NIH clinical trial definition in January 2018. The definition of clinical trial now is a research study in which 1 or more human subjects are prospectively assigned to 1 or more interventions to evaluate the effect of these interventions on health-related biomedical or behavioral outcomes. With this expansion, previously non-CT applications now are classified as CT applications. Consequently, you need to strictly follow CT guidelines in grants preparation. To meet this change, each FOA has been updated, specifying whether a clinical trial application is allowed or not. Non-compliant applications may be returned without a review. It is important to note additional criteria are applied to the review of clinical trial SBIR STTR applications. The same 5 scored review criteria are used for clinical trial applications. However, additional requirements may be associated with them. As an example, for the investigators criteria, you need to demonstrate a CT experience and the ability of the investigative team to perform clinical trials. A proposed clinical trial application may include study design, methods, and interventions that are not by themselves innovative, but address important questions or unmet needs. In addition, study timeline is included as a review criterion. This is not individually scored, but can affect the overall final score. For further information on the CT policy, please refer to the URL in the previous slide. Thanks for attending this session. I will turn this to Dr. Roger Miller for further presentation.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Yang. Now, after that excellent introduction to the NIH review process for your SBIR grant, I want to go over the basics of the grant program itself so you understand how to construct an application that does well. If you have any questions after the meeting, you're welcome to contact me. My email's here at the bottom of the slide. As Dr. Yang discussed, your project must stimulate technological innovation. This is the SBIR Innovation, I for Innovation, and NIH may not fund your application if the initial review group notes that there's a lack of technological innovation, or if that comes up at the second level of review for advisory council, or if it's revealed just before the award is made that a similar product is already available in the commercial marketplace. So please make it clear in the application what your innovation is, what intellectual property you have around that innovation, and how your project's going to develop that into a commercially viable product. You also must meet the SBIR program eligibility criteria, which I'll go over here. And again, NIDCD staff will go over the application at the very end before an award is made to make sure all these are met. So you may find yourself in an unfortunate position of having an application that initially looked good in the peer review system, but one of these eligibility criteria were not met, and then you will not be able to receive any funding under this unique grant program. So your small business concern must be organized for profit. It must be located in the United States, and you'll need to read the fine print in the FOA to ensure that your company is at least 51% owned and controlled by a US citizen. It has to be small, meaning you must have 500 or fewer employees. This typically isn't a problem. Oftentimes we have 2, 3, less than 10 employees in the small businesses. You must not include any foreign components. If you include a foreign manufacturing site, we may be able to work around your project and just remove the funds that you had anticipated spending outside the United States, but your application might also be administratively returned. So don't include any foreign study components, manufacturing sites. All the funds must be spent within the United States. We have strict limits on the amounts of efforts that must be effort and funds spent within the small business. So I'll go over that more in a later slide, but be sure to follow these limits, or again, your application cannot be funded. For the STTR program, and I'll get into what these acronyms mean in a minute, but for the STTR program, you can be a PI at an academic institution and move forward with the application and the award. But understand that it's the small business that actually receives the award. For the SBIR grant program, the PI must be 51% employed by the small company. That doesn't mean that the application has to include 51 or more percent support FTE for that particular person. You might just put 30% of an FTE or 100% of an FTE, but the PI must leave any other large company or academic institution so they can be 51% employed by the small company. That doesn't need to happen until the award is actually made. The funding levels for these two programs are determined by Congress, and I want to make it clear to everyone that the SBIR program is about 7 times as large as the STTR program. The STTR program exists so that the small business can leverage capabilities that are only present inside U.S. research institutions and still move forward with the project with the potential for commercialization. It's typical that the PI for an STTR application is an academic PI, so they know how to make use of that technology, those capabilities within academia, and they're trying to translate it out into the small business for commercialization. But I've shown by the relative area between the green and the blue circles here that the STTR program actually has a set aside of 7 times larger. So we have 7 times more funds to spend here in the SBIR program than the STTR program. Nevertheless, we have to spend set-asides for both of these programs, but be aware that when you're competing in the STTR program, you're going to have to show that it's a good fit for that, and you're leveraging capabilities inside the U.S. research institution that really advantage the project. Here are the set-asides that I mentioned earlier. For the STTR, the small business concern can spend as little as 40% of the funds, and the university as much as 60% of the funds. But you see the 60% that can go to the university under the STTR far exceeds what's allowable under the SBIR program. In the SBIR program, the goal is to build up the capabilities of the small business so they can compete for federal funding under different grant programs. So most of the money should be spent within the small business, at least 60% for phase 1 and 50% for phase 2. This allows you to outsource some effort, some of the funds, to a contract research organization when necessary. But understand the SBIR program is there so you can buy equipment, bring things into the small business, and build that capability up there, so long as you're doing something which has the potential for commercialization of the project at the end. The SBIR and the STTR programs are built around a phase 1, where proof of concept is established, phase 2, where the research and development is completed, and then phase 3, commercialization. That's when you actually are selling something. That's outside of the SBIR grant program at NIH. We don't actually buy your product, where in some federal agencies, you might find that the agency actually participates in commercialization. So let's talk about phase 1. It's possible for you to submit a phase 1 application without any pilot data whatsoever. And many times that's what comes in. It's a scientifically valid, novel approach that has no preliminary data whatsoever. And you won't be criticized by the peer review system in the SBIR program for a phase 1 application that doesn't have this pilot data. The project duration is typically 6 months for an SBIR, but it can be longer. You can ask for a 2-year project if that's appropriate for your particular needs. For the STTR program, it's typically 1 year, but it can be shorter than that if that's appropriate for your needs. The total costs are capped at about $250,000. We used to talk about guideline costs for these different programs, and we've changed our wording now, so we talk about a cap. It needs to be at this level or lower for total costs unless you meet a waiver topic, and I'll get more into that in a later slide. For phase 2, you would submit an application which is based on the preliminary data that you got in phase 1, and now you're held to a rigorous review of whether or not this is actually going to work. So you'll need that pilot data, and it'll have to be appropriate for the claims that you're making for your product. Phase 2 awards are typically 2 years in duration, but they can be longer. You can ask for 3 years if you need that to develop your prototype and then use it in your study. And they're capped at an award that's currently this amount. We'll talk about the waivers again. And the guideline costs, typically they're averaging around $1 million total costs over the 2 years. Phase 2 application has to include a commercialization plan, and this has to be convincing. So after you've done your full research and development, how are you going to go from completing the product development to an actual commercial phase? You need to describe that in your phase 2 application. NIDCD also allows you to come back for a second bite at the apple. If you spent phase 2 working on development of your prototype at the benchtop and getting it to perform to specific specifications for something that's not currently possible, you can come back to NIDCD for another phase 2 award. We call this a phase 2B. Not all ICs participate at NIH. NIDCD does, but it can only be used to support clinical trials with a large number of participants to adequately validate the safety or efficacy of your novel product. I described that you could ask for budgets above those caps. These are the budget waiver topics, and they're published in the application instructions. And NIDCD has 3. One is for research and development of technologies that require clearance by the FDA as a regulated product before commercial distribution. We also allow you to have larger budgets if you're going to develop a novel open source software, open design hardware that will enable research beyond what's currently possible with existing tools, or projects with clinical trials that have large numbers of participants. Success rates is always a question on everyone's mind. How likely is it that my application will be funded? And I have to say, it's not a random process, so you can't take these numbers too seriously. If you have an idea that's not likely to be commercialized, you'll get a poor score and it's not likely to get funded. If you have a novel technology that is clearly going to lead to a significant gain in healthcare within the NIDCD mission areas, you're very likely to get funded under this grant program. But let's go through what the success rates were for all applications at NIH for the SBIR and the STTR programs across 2 years, fiscal year 18, fiscal year 19. I didn't have the fiscal year 20 numbers aren't out yet. So looking at the phase 1 application, you can see that across the different programs and across the different years, they're holding pretty steady at around 20%, which is a pretty good overall success rate. You see the STTRs from 1 year to the next and the SBIRs from 1 year to the next are not altogether different, but they're substantially less than the success rate for the phase 2s. This makes sense because the phase 1 applications were funded before applicants got to phase 2. And so this phase 1 review process weeded out poor teams, ideas that didn't have a clear plan for commercialization. And after the team was actually received funding, it makes sense that they'd have the preliminary data to put in a more successful phase 2. Now, it's also possible under just the SBIR program to submit a direct to phase 2. This means the companies had some other way of getting that convincing preliminary data, and they come directly in and ask for a phase 2. This is a pilot program, so it's not always available. If we have congressional approval, we can do it. And we did not have that in fiscal year 17, but we did have it in fiscal year 18. And you can see there's a lower success rate for a direct to phase 2. I'll have to say that I don't think this is actually true for applications coming into NIDCD. I see very similar success rates for phase 2s that are directly submitted or phase 2s that come in off the street. And I think that's because the groups that come in with the direct to phase 2 are typically experienced SBIR companies. Now there is another option, and that's the fast track option. That allows you to combine the phase 1 and the phase 2 applications all in one package. You don't get any extra space. It's the same length as a typical phase 2 SBIR or STTR application, and you have to include clear milestones for the phase 1 portion of the work. Say how you're going to do the studies, what preliminary data you anticipate getting, and what milestones would indicate that you were successful in your phase 1 for getting proof of concept. You can see that the success rates there are about at the same level as a phase 1, indicating that that's more difficult to do than to wait until you submit and receive your phase 1 funding and then submit the phase 2 with the preliminary data you have. This is what I typically recommend to applicants. If you're new to the SBIR or STTR grant program, just go for a direct phase 1, see what works, get the feedback from the reviewer, and then come for phase 2 later. This data is available publicly at report.nih.gov. The fiscal year 20 data will come out soon, and you can track this in the future. And you can drill down to the IC level to see what success rates are at different ICs here at NIH. Dr. Yang talked about clinical trials and the extra information you had to provide in the application. And I want to encourage everyone, if you're including human subjects in your study, to go ahead and think about why it couldn't be an NIH-defined clinical trial. Here are the 4 study questions that you have to ask. Are you involving human subjects? Are the participants assigned to an intervention? The answer here is yes. Many people think that if there's not a control, if everyone gets the intervention, that they're not assigned it, and that's not true. They are assigned it. Is the study designed to evaluate the effect of the intervention? If you're designing a product, chances are that you are doing the study to evaluate the effect of the intervention. So the answer here in the SBIR program is going to be yes. And if you're submitting to NIH or NIDCD, it's going to be a health-related biomedical or behavioral outcome. People are afraid of this many times because they think it's going to be extra work, but as Dr. Yang described, there are forms for you to fill in that gives you an opportunity to tell the reviewers how you're going to do the study and assuage any concerns they might have about your ability to do that study. So you get the advantage of peer review. That's a good thing. That means your results are going to have enhanced rigor and reproducibility. You'll have to register your clinical trial at clinicaltrials.gov, but that's going to aid in enrollment and dissemination of your results. And if you're trying to commercialize this, dissemination of your positive results is a good thing. After you've done a clinical trial, you'll be able to tell people that might license your technology that it's been validated through a clinical trial, an NIH-defined clinical trial, and that will increase the value of your intellectual property. You'll also avoid concerns from the reviewers about the protection of your human subjects because you get those extra pages to describe exactly how you're going to do that. And that's going to likely result in a better score. So if you're involving human subjects in your studies in the SBIR or STTR grant programs, you're almost certainly going to use the clinical trial version of funding opportunity announcements. Finally, I want to encourage everyone to go to the sbir.nih.gov website. Here's the HTML link. Click on funding, which is in the red dot here, and click on the omnibus submenu for that, and you'll see the different funding opportunity announcements. You can see that there's a variant where the clinical trial is required, and you can see there's a variant where the clinical trial is not allowed. So choose whether you're going to submit an SBIR or an STTR, and whether or not you're going to include a clinical trial. You can see the waiver topics that I described are available here. You can see the instructions here, and these funding opportunities tend to hang around for a year or 2, and then they're replaced. So if you keep coming back to sbir.nih.gov and click on these links, you always get the latest funding opportunity announcements.